Sorry, I'm sitting a little high. Oh, how's that? Good. I think we're back to where we were. Okay, so this is part 4 of the Turkish century. I'm not even going to say the other part, from them titties to Turk. Got my rum and coke here. Make sure it's good. Yep. Let's get on with the video. I went back a few seconds, just...
When Tsar Peter I of Russia, also known as the Great, died in 1725, he left behind a last will and testament unlike any other Tsars before him. It was meant to be shown not just to his direct successor, but to be read by each and every single Tsar or Tsarina after him the moment they ascended to the throne. It wasn't something that he had left behind for them, but a simple instruction: go and conquer Constantinople. The 1800s were a century of imperial expansion and nationalists.
Okay, stupid question. What if one of them already did? Does the next one have to go and reconquer it?
Separatism. Powerful states and ideas would equally come down on the Ottomans with intense pressure. And even though they would try to reform and revive their dying empire, they would find themselves unable to avert disaster. The ideas which the French Revolution had spawned of...
Sorry. Also, why was he so fixated on Constantinople? I know it was a difficult thing. Did the Ottomans have that area locked down? Did he not like the Ottomans? Did he just hate that town? Constantinople. It's just a small town. Anyone? Anything?
Men as equals, a people's right to self-determination, as well as nationalism, came to be the first thing to bite the Ottomans when the Greeks rebelled during their revolution of the 1820s. Foreign interests, however, also played a role in this. The Greeks were initially losing their revolution until foreign powers saw use in a weakened Ottoman Empire and sent their fleets to help the Greeks achieve victory. This was the tipping point. For the first time, a people under Ottoman rule had risen in revolt against its imperial overlords and won their independence. It showed to all the others what was possible. It showed the Europeans that they could expand their influence over the Ottoman Empire by supporting separatism. It showed the Arabs that their overlords were weaker than expected and beatable. Until this moment, the Ottomans might have even still had a chance to turn things around and possibly avoid a total collapse. But from this moment on, it became unavoidable. The Greek Revolution was one of the biggest, if not the biggest nail in the Ottoman coffin. It would form the basis of a new Greek national identity, form the basis of conflict and antagonism that would last to this very day. And
Greek Revolution. I'll have to write that down as something to check out. I'm going to guess it's worth it. But I forgot what I was going to say. It was something a few seconds ago about the Arabs realizing that their something was weaker than expected. So I'm going to guess that's definitely a clash that's going to be coming in the future.
From the first Greek day of independence onward, the Ottomans would huddle from one disaster into another. The first to take advantage were the French, who invaded Ottoman Algeria 2 years after Greek independence and made it a colonial province of the French Empire. Also 2 years after Greek independence, the Egyptians revolted, took Jerusalem and Damascus, and gained great autonomy. The Ottomans had to get the British for help to regain control over the Levant, but the British would only do so in exchange for Cyprus. Both had to recognize Egyptian autonomy, marking the first time in centuries that an Arab nation asserted itself again on the world stage, with a ruler intent on modernizing and building a modern Arab monarchy. However, we don't know how that would have gone, as Britain took advantage of this fledgling little new state by occupying it, and Egypt was thereby forced into another empire.
What?
2 years before the end of the Greek Revolution, the Ottomans, in an attempt to clamp down and gain more control over their European lands, cracked down on the Bektashi Muslims of Albania. which resulted in a decade of continuous Albanian uprisings. In 1931, Bosnian Muslim landlords rebelled against land reform. The uprising was brutally crushed, and in an attempt to solve the problem, the Ottomans split the lands up into new administrative sections, giving some of it to their Serbian vassals, which created new problems that themselves kept continuously creating new problems to this day. The Serbs themselves kept having uprisings, and so did the Macedonians, the Montenegrins, the Bulgarians, and the Greeks, who were still under Ottoman rule. All this turmoil and chaos convinced outsiders that this place was falling apart and up for grabs. It also fell into a time of greater Russian imperial ambitions under a growing nationalist pan-Slavic movement, a movement that dreamed of a greater Slavic empire, who referred to Istanbul not as Constantinople, but as Tsaringrad, a future capital for such an empire, proclaiming that the turmoil was proof that the Ottomans were mistreating their Christians and referring to the previously mentioned treaty that gave them the role as the guarantor of safety and protector of Christians in the Islamic world. The Russians invaded in 1854 during what became known as the Crimean War, and it seemed like the Ottomans were in for the next big disaster, possibly even the final one. However, the Russians may have been correct about the Ottomans falling apart, but they had gotten greedy, and with their invasion that was clearly aimed at Constantinople, they upset the European balance of powers. Those European nations may have hated each other, but they certainly didn't want a massive, overly powerful Russian empire dominating the Mediterranean and the Balkans. So in the end, the Russians accomplished something completely different, something that was almost impossible the year before, an alliance between the British, the French, and the Austrians that forced the Russians out of the Balkans, and for good measure also sank the Russian fleet. But the resulting peace agreement exposed how the Ottomans' supposed allies and saviors were in reality just there to snatch bits and pieces for themselves. The British got even...
Didn't they realize that when all those foreign powers were helping the countries that they were kind of controlling? And then they had to turn to those countries for help? What? Maybe they didn't. I guess maybe they didn't know. Oh, that makes it even worse. They didn't know, and those countries were... Oh, wow.
More concessions over Cyprus. The French gained the title of protector of Christianity in the Ottoman lands, and they would in the future themselves use it just like the Russians as a crowbar to justify wars. And the Ottomans had to give up even more control over Serbia and Romania. By this time, it would take drastic measures to save the empire, which the Ottomans conducted in 1856 by abolishing the Islamic Sharia-based social order, inviting foreigners to help build a new army, restructured the state to have equal direct representation for all ethnic groups, and even built a nice modern palace in European style as they adopted
That was beautiful.
European dress codes. But these changes were mainly cosmetic and didn't have much impact on changing the overall situation, as things continued mostly as usual. Next came a rebellion of Serbs and Herzegovina.
I apologize for all the pausing. So they changed the outer appearance, but everything internal was exactly the same, which was apparently building towards not being good. I mean, revolts and stuff like that, so.
Who had risen up against Bosnian Muslim landlords. The 1860s brought a Greek insurrection in Crete and an uprising of Arabs in Lebanon, and this was followed by the next great disaster. In 1876, the Bulgarians rose up in revolt. Probably sick and tired of it all, the Ottomans made a monumentally stupid and horrible decision. Instead of just putting down the insurrections as they had done so many times before, they sent an army that raped, burnt, robbed, pillaged, slaughtered, and massacred its way through Bulgaria. In an attempt to pacify the place by terrorizing its people, tens of thousands of civilians were slaughtered. What this war is most remembered for are the mass beheadings. Every time an Ottoman army would march into a town, city or village, all men aged 14 to 50 were gathered together in the town square and beheaded as the town was forced to watch.
Jesus.
However, by 1876, newspapers were in wide circulation and had become part of everyone's daily life. Most nations had by then agreed to basic sets of rules of war that forbade the intentional slaughter of civilians. French, British, German, Italians, Russian, South American and American journalists were all over Bulgaria, witnessing and writing about these atrocities. From one end of the world to the other, the news of what the Ottomans were doing spread, and the world united in disgust and condemnation of the Ottomans. Seeing all this, the Russians invaded, and this time nobody was going to help the Ottomans. This war, the 11th Russo-Turkish War, was an even bigger disaster for the Ottomans than the independence of Greece and all its previous military defeats. In the previous years, the Ottomans had tried to modernize their army, British and American rifles, German artillery, and British ironclad ships. But the Ottomans had not trained their army on how to use modern equipment and still relied on 200-year-old outdated defensive military tactics. They just hunkered down in trenches, hoping the Russians would do suicidal 17th century bayonet charges. Instead, the Russians shelled them into oblivion with modern artillery. The invading Russian army was also welcomed as liberators by the Bulgarians, Romanians, Armenians, and Serbs. The British and French only intervened and stopped the Russians when they were only a few miles away from Istanbul. In the resulting peace treaty, the Russians annexed the last remaining Ottoman lands in the northern Caucasus and East Armenia. Romania declared full independence and became a Russian ally. Montenegro declared independence. Serbia doubled in size, declared full independence, and became a Russian ally. Bulgaria officially became an autonomous state in the Ottoman Empire, but unofficially was independent and allied with Russia. A mass exodus of Muslims fled these new states.
So, is that why the Soviet Union had amassed so many? Eventually, they broke off into independent nations. Ukraine. Wow, my mind just went blank. Insert those other ones. Just imagine I said them right now. Is that how they were able to kind of get them all on their side? I'm doing this as though the countries actually moved, but they all aligned to be under their security in a way, and they kept them until, geez, what was that, 1990s? Early 90s? Is that when they all broke up? Or is that just unrelated? Apologies for all the questions. I'm drinking, so, I talk a lot.
What became one of the world's first recorded refugee crises. In total, 1.5 million who swamped the cities of the empire in slums and squalor. The modernized Ottoman Balkan army had been wiped out. The Ottoman buffer between it and Russia was gone. In any future war, the Russians could now just march right up to Istanbul. And it had also started something else. The Armenians had welcomed the invading Russians in eastern Armenia as liberators, and western Armenia was still in the Ottoman Empire. The Russians now declared themselves to be the protectors of the Armenians in that empire. The Ottomans now looked with ever-deepening suspicions on them. Something started happening that would, a few decades down the road, lead to one of the worst crimes of the century. However, the end of that war gave the Ottomans also a brief respite, and it came through another series of events that started during that war, something unexpected that must have seemed almost comedic at the time. During the war when the
this just hit me. They said something would happen to the Armenians down the road. Was that it's the Armenian massacre? Was that World War I? Am I thinking right? And is that they don't acknowledge that it happened? Not the Armenians. Armenians, it happened. A lot of them were massacred. But is it Turkey that says it just didn't happen, or it didn't happen as they say? Whatever. Is that what that was referring to? I apologize for all the questions. I really do.
Serbs marched south and doubled their land in size. They invaded Greece. The Austrians threatened them into getting out of Greece, but the Serbs started something else with that. The Ottomans still controlled vast patches of Balkan lands, but in these lands, intoxicated by nationalist delusions of grandeur and even race, Serb, Greek, Bulgarian, and Albanian nationalists started killing each other before the Ottomans were even gone, so they could have more for themselves once those Ottomans were actually gone. For centuries, these people had lived together in peace and harmony, but with the idea of separation also came the need for new ideas, justifications, and fictions around which to unite a new nation around. In that climate, what separated people became more important than what they had in common, and what differentiated people often was arbitrary. Bosnians are not Turks, but Slavs who converted to Islam centuries ago. So are they Serbs of different faith, as some Serb nationalists claim? Or are they foreign invaders, as other Serb nationalists claim? Or something else entirely? Are Slavs that migrated to northern Macedonia Greeks? Are Orthodox Bulgarians Greeks? Who gets what cultural heritage? Should all Slavs be in one state? Should Greece have what it claims to have had 1,000 years ago? As the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the Balkans, the newly emergent entities started engaging each other in hostility. Serbs against Greeks, against Bulgarians and vice versa, over who the people in the remaining lands were and should be part of. 30 years before the Ottomans had even left those lands. These fights were the forerunners of wars soon to come, but also the harbinger of greater catastrophes to befall the Balkans in the closing years of the 20th century. During the war with Russia, the other European powers met at a conference in Berlin where they divided Africa up amongst themselves, but also secretly divided up the remaining Ottoman lands in Africa without even telling them. The British made Cyprus a full protectorate and occupied Egypt, which was technically still an Ottoman protectorate. The French invaded Tunisia and made it part of their empire. The Ottomans were furious, but there was little to nothing they could do. Within a time period of only 70 years, the once mightiest empire of the hemisphere had shrunken down to a fifth of its former size. A quarter of its population was still Christian, but it had lost almost all it had in Europe besides northern Macedonia, northern Greece, Rumelia, and Crete. All its African vassals were gone, with the exception of Libya, which was basically just a scrap of sand and not worth that much. The Caucasus had slipped away into the hands of Russia, who were by now their biggest threat and right at their doorstep. The Mediterranean was now mostly under British control, and in the remaining Arab lands, the empire had lost much of its legitimacy as an Islamic spiritual leader, as the Arabs increasingly turned away to seek new leaders and solutions. In this mess, a group of idealistic young men would lash out in an attempt to save what was left, but in the end would only bring upon themselves the end of the empire.
I'm going to go ahead and, I don't know what this is here. I'm going to go ahead and end this here. It hasn't been a full 15 minutes, but it's a good stopping spot. So, I don't understand why it's doing that. Anyways, none of that matters. Like and subscribe, or them Tootsie Pops ain't going to tickle on Tuesdays. I don't even know what that means. Have a good day. Have a good night.